The auction lasted 11 minutes. Nobody wanted the mill. It was the 4th of September, 1851, and the town of Calvary, Arkansas, was holding its annual tax sale on the courthouse steps, a ritual of failure in which the county disposed of properties whose owners had died, defaulted, or simply walked away. The auctioneer, a thin man named Phelps with a voice like a saw blade, had already sold 2 farmsteads and a tannery lot that morning to modest but genuine bidding. But when he reached the final item on the list, a silence settled over the small crowd that had nothing to do with respect and everything to do with contempt. "Lot number 7, Phelps announced, consulting his ledger. "The Harker Mill property, 46 acres on the Little Mulberry River, 3 miles north of town. Improvements include 1 grist mill, stone construction, currently collapsed. Water rights included. Taxes owed, $14.60. Who'll start the bidding at $15? No one moved. A few men shifted their weight. Someone coughed. $15 for 46 acres with water rights, Phelps repeated, an edge of irritation entering his voice. Gentlemen, that's less than $0.33 per acre. A man near the back of the crowd, a farmer named Gideon Searle, who owned the best bottomland in the county, laughed softly and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "You could bid 15 cents and still be overpaying. That mill's been dead since Harker drowned in it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the gathering. Everyone in Calvary knew the story of the Harker Mill. Amos Harker had built it in 1832, harnessing the Little Mulberry, where it dropped through a narrow limestone gorge with enough force to turn a 4-foot overshot wheel. For 11 years, the mill had ground corn and wheat for every farm in the valley, and Harker had prospered. Then, in the spring flood of 1843, the river had risen 8 feet in a single night. The gorge became a torrent. The mill race wall collapsed, the wheel jammed, and Amos Harker, trying to free it in the dark, was pulled under and drowned. His body was found 2 miles downstream, tangled in a deadfall of river birch. His widow had tried to sell the property, but no one would buy a mill that had killed its owner. She moved to her sister's home in Fort Smith and let the taxes lapse. Over the following 8 years, the mill had continued its slow collapse. The roof fell in during the winter of 1846. The east wall followed in 1849. By the time the county seized the property for back taxes, the Harker Mill was little more than a heap of mossy limestone rubble straddling a gorge, and the general opinion in Calvary was that the river had reclaimed what the river had always owned. $10, Phelps tried. $5. Gentlemen, the county needs to clear this lot. Silence. $1, said a voice from the edge of the crowd. Heads turned. The voice belonged to a man most of them recognized, but few could claim to know. His name was Eben Pulk, and he was 34 years old, the youngest of 3 sons of a minister who had preached in Calvary for 20 years before dying of consumption in 1848. Eben was slight and dark-haired, with the kind of face that people's eyes moved over without stopping, unremarkable in feature, quiet in expression. He had his father's long hands and his mother's habit of listening more than he spoke. He had never married. He lived alone in a rented room above the dry goods store, worked odd jobs, carpentry, fence mending, hauling, and spent his evenings reading books that he borrowed from the small lending library that the Presbyterian Church maintained in its vestry. His 2 older brothers had left Calvary years ago, Marcus to practice law in Little Rock and Owen to run a mercantile in Memphis. Neither had invited Eben to join them, and Eben had not asked. There had been no dramatic falling out, no inheritance dispute, no single moment of rejection. It was subtler than that, and in some ways worse. They had simply stopped seeing him. He was present at family dinners and absent from family plans. He was invited to holidays and excluded from conversations about the future. When their father died, Marcus and Owen returned for the funeral, divided the minister's modest estate between themselves, a watch for Marcus, a set of books for Owen, and left again without asking whether Eben needed anything. He didn't, or told himself he didn't, which amounted to the same thing. He was, in the way that youngest sons sometimes are, a man whom his family had simply stopped thinking about. $1, Eben repeated. Gideon Searle turned fully around to look at him. You're buying the Harker mill? I'm buying the land. The land's a gorge, Polk. You can't farm a gorge. I know. And the mill's a pile of rocks. I know that too. Phelps, eager to close the lot, brought down his gavel. Sold. $1 to Eben Pulk. Come sign the papers, Mr. Polk. Eben walked to the courthouse steps, signed his name in the ledger, and paid his $1 from a handful of coins. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of the crowd. Not hostile, not even mocking, really, just baffled. A man had just paid $1 for a dead man's ruined mill. There was no sense in it. But Eben Pulk had never been the kind of man whose choices made sense to other people, and he had long ago stopped expecting them to. He collected the deed and walked north out of town, following the wagon road that ran along the Little Mulberry toward the hills. The September heat was thick, the air heavy with the smell of dust and dry grass and the faintest sweetness of wild muscadine ripening in the thickets along the river. Eben walked for an hour, his shadow shortening beneath him until the road narrowed to a track and the track descended into the gorge where the Little Mulberry cut through a shelf of Ozark limestone in a series of pools and drops and whitewater runs. The mill was there, or what remained of it. He had seen it before, of course. Everyone in Calvary had seen the Harker mill at one time or another. It was visible from the road, or had been before the trees grew up around it. But Eben had come here more often than most. He had come as a boy of 16, 3 years after Harker's death, drawn by curiosity and by the sound of the river, a sound that changed with the seasons, from the deep roar of spring floods to the quiet, steady chatter of late summer. He had come as a young man, sitting on the rubble of the east wall and reading while the water ran past. He had come after his father died, when the rented room above the dry goods store felt too small and too still, and the gorge felt like the only place in the world that was moving. And each time he came, he noticed the same thing. The wheel was still turning, not the whole wheel. The Harker mill's overshot wheel, a 4-foot diameter construction of white oak with wooden buckets bolted to its rim, had been partly buried when the mill race wall collapsed. The upper half was gone, shattered or carried downstream by the flood, but the lower half remained, wedged between the limestone walls of the gorge, and the river, which had not stopped running just because a man had drowned, still poured through the narrow channel where the mill race had been, still caught the surviving buckets, still pushed them in a slow, grinding rotation that had been going on, Eben realized, for 8 years. 8 years. The river had been turning what was left of the wheel for 8 years, and no one had noticed. Or rather, no one had thought it mattered. Eben had thought it mattered. He had thought about it for a long time. He had thought about it during the long evenings in his rented room, reading borrowed books on hydraulics and milling and the properties of moving water. He had thought about it while mending fences and hauling lumber for men who paid him $1 a day and never asked his name twice. He had thought about it, and he had done the arithmetic, and when Phelps called for bids on the Harker Mill property, Eben was ready. He climbed down into the gorge now, picking his way over the tumbled limestone blocks that had once been walls. The stone was pale gray, thickly furred with moss on the north-facing surfaces, warm to the touch where the September sun reached it. The rubble was extensive. Eben estimated 40 or 50 tons of cut stone scattered across the gorge floor and the adjacent banks, but it was not random. He could see the outlines of the original structure, the foundation walls, still largely intact beneath the debris, the mill race channel, choked with stone and silt, but clearly defined, the wheel pit, where the massive axle had once seated, and the wheel, half a wheel, turning in the current, slow and steady, like a heart that refused to stop beating. Eben knelt beside it. The oak was darkened with age and water, but the wood was sound. White oak was nearly impervious to rot when kept wet, and the constant immersion had preserved the surviving structure far better than air and weather would have. The iron bolts that held the buckets were rusted but intact. The axle stub protruded from the limestone wall where it had once connected to the mill's grinding mechanism, and it too was turning. Slowly, with a faint grinding sound, but turning. He put his hand on the axle and felt the vibration. The river's power, transmitted through wood and iron, steady and patient and immense. The little mulberry dropped 14 feet through the gorge. Eben had measured it himself with a plumb line and a length of string, and the volume of water, even in the low flow of late summer, was considerable. In spring, when the snowmelt came down from the hills, the flow would triple. This river could power more than a grist mill. Eben knew that. He had read about it. In the books he borrowed from the church library, volumes on mechanics, on water power, on the industrial applications of hydraulic force. He had learned that a 14-foot head of water could drive not just millstones, but saws, lathes, trip hammers, bellows. A properly built water-powered workshop could cut lumber, forge iron, grind grain, and press cider, all from the same turning shaft. The technology was centuries old. The Romans had used it. The monasteries of medieval Europe had built entire economies around it. And here, in the Ozark Hills of Arkansas, a river was turning a broken wheel and wasting its power on empty air. Eben sat on a limestone block and took out a small notebook he kept in his coat pocket. He began to sketch. He started clearing the rubble the next morning. It was work that would have broken most men, and it nearly broke Eben. The limestone blocks were heavy. The largest weighed 300 pounds or more, and he had no mule, no cart, no help. He worked with a pry bar, a sledgehammer, and the patient leverage of wooden rollers he fashioned from hickory logs. Each stone had to be moved individually, pried loose from the pile, rolled or dragged to a staging area on the bank above the gorge, and stacked according to size and shape. He sorted them as he went. Eben had worked enough carpentry and masonry jobs to recognize good-cut stone, and Harker's masons had been skilled. Many of the blocks were still square and true, their faces dressed smooth, their corners sharp despite 8 years of weather. These he stacked separately, knowing he would use them again. The damaged stones, cracked, rounded, too small to be useful, he piled along the riverbank as riprap, reinforcing the banks against future flooding. The work took weeks, then months. Through September and October, Eben descended into the gorge each morning at first light and worked until the sun dropped behind the western ridge. He ate sparingly, cornbread, dried pork, whatever he could afford from his meager savings, and the odd jobs he still took on days when his body demanded rest from the stones. He lost weight. His hands blistered, healed, calloused, and blistered again. His shoulders ached constantly, a deep bone pain that woke him in the dark hours and wouldn't let him sleep again until he rose and stretched and walked circles in his small rented room like an animal in a stall. There were days when the futility of the project pressed down on him like the weight of the stones themselves. He would spend an entire morning moving a single block, 6 inches at a time, pry and roll, and when it was done, he would look at the gorge and see that his day's labor had made no visible difference. The rubble seemed to regenerate. For every stone he cleared, another seemed to reveal itself beneath it, as though the gorge were testing him, measuring his resolve against its indifference. On those days, he would stop working and go stand beside the half-wheel. He would watch it turn, that slow, grinding, inexorable rotation, and he would remind himself of the arithmetic. 14 feet of drop, thousands of gallons per hour, even in low water. A force that never tired, never stopped, never asked for wages. The river was doing its part. All Eben had to do was clear the way. He spoke to no one about his plans. The people of Calvary, when they thought of him at all, thought of him as a fool, a quiet, harmless fool, which was the best kind, but a fool nonetheless. The storekeeper sold him his cornmeal and dried pork without comment. The landlord collected his rent without curiosity. His brothers did not write. He was, in those months, as isolated as any man could be while living in a town, surrounded by people who saw him every day and knew nothing about what he was becoming. But the gorge was clearing. Slowly, stone by stone, the shape of the original mill emerged from the rubble like a fossil from its matrix. The foundation was better than Eben had hoped. 3 courses of dressed limestone, mortared with lime and river sand, still level and solid after 19 years. The millrace channel, once cleared of debris, proved to be a masterwork of simple engineering. A stone-lined canal, 6 feet wide and 3 feet deep, that diverted water from a pool above the gorge, directed it over the wheel, and returned it to the river below. Harker had understood the gorge's geometry intimately, and his mill race followed the natural contours of the limestone with a precision that minimized the need for excavation. The wheel pit was the revelation. When Eben cleared the last stones from around the surviving half-wheel, he found something he hadn't expected: the original bearing blocks. 2 massive cubes of granite, not limestone, but granite, brought from God knew where at considerable expense, set into the foundation walls on either side of the pit. The bearing surfaces were worn smooth by years of rotation, concave with the shape of the axle, and they were perfect. Granite did not rot, did not crack in frost, did not wear away under the friction of a turning shaft the way softer stone would. Harker had built his bearings to outlast the mill itself, and they had. By late November, the foundation was fully exposed, and the mill race cleared. Eben stood in the gorge on a cold morning and looked at what he had uncovered. The bones of a mill, clean and strong, waiting to be rebuilt. The river poured through the cleared mill race with a sound like applause. The half-wheel turned in its ancient rhythm, and Eben felt, for the first time in his adult life, that he was standing in the right place. He recorded it in his notebook, in the small, precise handwriting that he had inherited from his father. November 27th, 1851. Foundation clear. Bearings sound. The river is ready. So am I. Winter in the Ozarks was a gray, wet, punishing season. Not as cold as the northern states, but raw, with freezing rains that coated every surface in ice and a persistent dampness that settled into joints and lungs. Eben could not work in the gorge during the worst of it. The stones were too slippery, the water too high, the risk of a fall too great. He used the time to plan. In his rented room, by the light of a tallow candle, he drew. He had no formal training in engineering or drafting, but he had a spatial imagination that his borrowed books had sharpened into something approaching skill. He drew the mill as it would be, not a simple grist mill like Harker's, but a multi-purpose water-powered workshop. The wheel, a new wheel, larger than Harker's, 5 feet in diameter, would drive a main shaft running the length of the building. From this shaft, through a system of gears, pulleys, and belts, power could be directed to multiple stations: a pair of millstones for grinding grain, a vertical saw for cutting lumber, a lathe for turning wood, and a trip hammer for forging iron. The designs were ambitious, perhaps too ambitious for a man with $60 in savings and no crew. But Eben had learned, through years of working for other men, that ambition tempered by patience was not recklessness. It was planning. He would build in stages, the wheel and the main shaft first, then the millstones, because grinding grain was the most immediate source of income, then the saw, because the Ozark Hills were thick with timber and the nearest sawmill was 18 miles away. The lathe and the hammer could wait. He also planned the building itself. Harker's mill had failed not because of poor construction, but because of poor flood management. The mill race wall that collapsed had been built too close to the river's high water line, with no overflow channel to relieve pressure during spring floods. Eben would not make that mistake. His mill would sit higher on the gorge wall, anchored to the limestone bedrock. The mill race would include a bypass gate, a heavy timber sluice that could be opened during high water to divert the flow around the wheel, protecting the mechanism while letting the flood pass harmlessly. It was a technique he had read about in a treatise on English mill design from the 17th century, and it was elegantly simple. Work with the river's power, but give the river room to be itself. Spring came in March of 1852, tentative and muddy. The river swelled with snowmelt, and Eben watched from the bank as the water level in the gorge rose 6 feet, then 8, then 10. The cleared mill race became a torrent. The half-wheel, still wedged in its place, spun wildly in the flood current, its ancient buckets throwing white water into the air. Eben watched it and made notes. Peak flow dates, estimated volume, the height at which water began to overtop the foundation walls. Data. Everything was data, if you knew how to read it. When the flood receded in April, Eben went to work. He could not do it alone, and he did not try. He hired 2 men from Calvary, brothers named Wick and Samuel Hadley, young, strong, and willing to work for 75 cents a day, plus meals. The Hadley brothers had the good-natured skepticism of men who thought Eben was probably crazy, but were happy to be paid for watching him prove it. They cleared the remaining debris, mixed mortar, and began rebuilding the mill race walls under Eben's precise direction. The mortar was a point of obsession. Eben had read that the Romans used a hydraulic cement made from volcanic ash that hardened under water, a critical property for structures in constant contact with river flow. He couldn't get volcanic ash in Arkansas, but he had found, in a geological survey published by the state, a reference to natural cement rock deposits in the Ozark Limestone Formation. After 2 weeks of searching along the river bluffs, he found what he was looking for: a stratum of argillaceous limestone that, when burned in a kiln and ground to powder, produced a cement that set hard even when submerged. He built a small kiln from river stones and spent a week burning and grinding the rock into a coarse gray powder that he mixed with sand and water to produce a mortar of remarkable strength. That's Roman cement, Eben told the Hadley brothers as they troweled it into the joints of the new mill race wall. Wick Hadley looked at the gray paste on his trowel. Looks like regular mud to me. It'll be harder than the stone in a month. If you say so. Eben said so, and he was right. The mortar cured to a hardness that resisted the river's constant erosion in a way that ordinary lime mortar never could. The mill race walls, when finished, were 3 feet thick at the base and angled outward to deflect flood pressure. The bypass gate, a heavy oak sluice in an iron frame, slid smoothly in its grooves. The wheel pit was squared and leveled, and the granite-bearing blocks, which had survived nearly 2 decades of neglect, were cleaned, checked for true, and pronounced sound. The wheel itself took the longest. Eben felled white oak from the ridges above the gorge, selecting only straight-grained trees of at least 18 inches in diameter, and split them into the staves, planks, and buckets that the wheel required. He had never built a water wheel before, but he had studied their construction in books with the intensity of a man who understood that theory and practice were different languages for the same truth. The hub was a solid cylinder of oak, 20 inches in diameter, bored through the center to accept the iron axle. The spokes radiated from the hub like the arms of a compass. 8 of them, each mortised into the hub and pinned with locust dowels. The rim was built in segments, steamed and bent to shape, bolted together with iron straps that Eben forged himself on a borrowed anvil. The buckets, 24 of them, were fastened to the rim's outer face, each angled to catch the falling water and hold it through the rotation, extracting maximum power from the river's drop. It was beautiful. Eben did not think of it in those terms. He thought of it as functional, as correct. But the Hadley brothers, watching him hang the completed wheel in the pit on a July morning, exchanged a look that acknowledged something beyond function. The wheel was 5 feet across, pale with fresh oak, its geometry precise, its surfaces smooth. When Eben opened the sluice gate, and the river poured into the mill race, and the water struck the first bucket, and the wheel began to turn, slowly at first, then faster, then settling into a steady, powerful rotation that shook the ground beneath their feet. Wick Hadley took off his hat and said, "Well, I'll be damned." The wheel turned. It had always been turning, in some form, since 1843. But now it turned with purpose. Word of the mill's resurrection reached Calvary the way most news reached small towns, through the men who witnessed it. The Hadley brothers told their neighbors told their wives told everyone. The reactions were mixed. Gideon Searle, who owned the best land in the county and the loudest opinion, declared that Eben Pulk had wasted a year rebuilding a dead man's mistake and would lose everything when the next flood came. The Presbyterian minister, Eben's father's successor, a young man named Reverend Collis, expressed cautious admiration from the pulpit, comparing Eben's perseverance to the rebuilding of the temple, which was generous, if theologically imprecise. Most people simply waited. The Ozarks rewarded patience and punished prediction, and the river would have the final word, as it always did. The river spoke that September. A late-season storm dropped 4 inches of rain on the hills in 2 days, and the Little Mulberry rose fast. 6 feet, then 8. Eben stood on the bluff above the gorge at dawn and watched the brown water climb toward his new walls. He had planned for this. He had measured for this, but planning and measuring were abstractions, and the river was not abstract. It was real, and it was angry, and it was coming. He climbed down into the gorge and opened the bypass gate. The heavy oak sluice slid upward in its iron grooves, smoothly, thank God, smoothly, and the diverted water poured through the bypass channel with a roar that shook the ground. The main mill race, relieved of the excess flow, dropped to a manageable level. The wheel slowed, but did not stop. The new walls held. The hydraulic cement, barely 2 months cured, did not crack, did not seep, did not yield. The flood peaked at midday and began to recede by evening. By the following morning, the river was back within its banks, the gorge was draining, and the mill stood exactly as it had stood before the storm, solid, intact, undamaged. Eben closed the bypass gate, engaged the wheel, and went back to work. Wick Hadley, who had watched the entire flood from the bluff with an expression that progressed from concern to astonishment to something approaching awe, said afterward, "That gate saved the mill." "The gate saved the mill," Eben agreed. "But the river built the gate. If I hadn't watched the spring flood and measured the high water, I wouldn't have known where to put it or how wide to make it." So the river saved itself. Eben thought about that. "The river doesn't need saving," he said. "It just needs room." It was the closest thing to a philosophy that Eben Pulk ever articulated, and it was sufficient for a lifetime. Eben ignored the remaining skeptics. He had a mill to finish. Through the late summer and autumn of 1852, he installed the grinding mechanism. The millstones, a pair of French burr stones, 30 inches in diameter, were the single most expensive purchase of the entire project. He ordered them from a dealer in St. Louis for $42, which represented nearly everything he had saved from the ore sales and odd jobs of the past year. They arrived by steamboat and then by wagon, each stone weighing nearly 800 pounds, and the process of transporting them from the river landing to the gorge and lowering them into the mill involved a system of ropes, pulleys, and controlled panic that Eben would later describe as the most dangerous thing he had ever done. But the stones were worth it. French burr, a freshwater quartz imported from the Paris basin, was the finest millstone material in the world, prized for its hardness, its ability to hold a dress, and the quality of the flour it produced. Lesser mills used local sandstone or granite, which wore quickly and produced a coarse, gritty meal. Eben's French burr stones would produce flour that rivaled any in the state. He built the grinding floor above the wheel pit, supported on heavy oak beams that transferred the vibration of the turning wheel into the steady rotational force required to drive the runner stone against the bed stone. The gearing was a masterpiece of wooden engineering. A large pit wheel on the main axle meshed with a smaller lantern gear on a vertical shaft, which in turn drove the runner stone through an iron rind, a cross-shaped fitting that connected the stone to the shaft, while allowing it to be raised and lowered to control the fineness of the grind. The first grain went through the mill on October 15th, 1852, almost exactly 1 year after Eben had begun clearing rubble from the gorge. It was a bushel of dried corn brought by Samuel Hadley's wife, who had been promised the first grinding free of charge. Eben opened the grain hopper, adjusted the stone gap, and engaged the gears. The wheel turned. The stones turned. The corn fed between them with a sound like sustained thunder, and the meal poured from the spout into a waiting sack, fine, even, golden, with the sweet smell that only freshly ground corn produces. Eben held a handful of the meal and let it sift through his fingers. A year of labor, thousands of stones moved, a wheel built from nothing, and now this, grain becoming flour, powered by nothing but falling water. He opened the mill for business on October 20th. He charged the standard rate, 1/8 of the grain as toll, and within a week, farmers were arriving from as far as 10 miles away, their wagons loaded with corn and wheat. The nearest competing mill was in Huntsville, 18 miles to the south, and the road was poor. Eben's mill, despite its reputation as a cursed and dangerous site, was closer, cheaper, and, once farmers saw the quality of the flour, simply better. The first farmers came warily. They drove their wagons down the track to the gorge and sat on the seat for a long moment, studying the rebuilt walls, the turning wheel, the clean new timbers of the mill building. Some of them had known Amos Harker. Some of them remembered the morning his body was pulled from the river. They looked at the water pouring through the mill race and wondered, perhaps, whether this mill would claim another man. Eben did not reassure them with words. He reassured them with flour. Each customer who came to the mill left with meal so fine, and even that it made their previous flour, ground on worn-out sandstone at distant mills, or laboriously pounded by hand in wooden mortars, seem like gravel by comparison. Word spread the way quality always spreads. One farmer told his neighbor, who told his cousin, who told the preacher, who mentioned it after Sunday service, and by November, Eben had a line of wagons on grinding days that stretched back up the track to the main road. There was a moment, Eben remembered it precisely, though he never spoke of it, when the turning point became visible. A farmer named Prewitt, who owned 80 acres of good wheat land south of Calvary, and who had been grinding at the Huntsville mill for 15 years, brought his entire autumn harvest to Eben's Gorge. 1,200 pounds of winter wheat. It was the largest single order the mill had received, and it took a full day to grind. When it was done, Prewitt ran the flour through his fingers, held it to his nose, tasted it on the tip of his tongue, the ritual of a man who knew grain the way a vintner knew wine, and said, "This is as good as anything I've had ground in St. Louis." "It's the stones," Eben said. "French burr." "It's the stones and the man running them," Prewitt corrected. He paid his toll and left, and from that week forward, he never ground his wheat anywhere else. Other farmers followed. By December, Eben was grinding 200 bushels a week. By the following spring, 300. The income was modest but steady, about $15 a week in toll grain, which Eben sold at market price or traded for supplies and labor. He reinvested almost everything. He hired Wick Hadley full-time as a mill hand. He built a small cabin on the bluff above the gorge. Nothing elaborate, just 2 rooms with a stone fireplace and a cedar shake roof, but warm and dry and his own. He ordered iron fittings and hardware from a foundry in Memphis, upgrading the wooden gears to iron where the stresses were greatest. He began constructing the saw frame. The sawmill was operational by the autumn of 1853. It was a simple up-and-down sash saw, a vertical blade driven by a crank mechanism off the main shaft, but it cut straight and true, and it could reduce a 20-foot log to planks in a fraction of the time required by hand. Timber was abundant in the hills. Labor was scarce. The combination made the sawmill immediately profitable. Farmers who had spent days hand-sawing boards for a barn could now bring their logs to Eben's mill and leave with finished lumber in hours. The grist mill and the sawmill together transformed Eben's economics. By 1854, his combined income exceeded $500 a year, more than most farmers in the county earned, more than his brother Marcus made practicing law in Little Rock, though Eben didn't know that and wouldn't have cared if he did. He was not building for wealth. He was building for completeness. He wanted the mill to do everything a mill could do, to extract from the river every ounce of useful work that the water's 14-foot drop could provide. It was the sound of the sawmill that brought Lenor Vashon to the gorge. She was walking the river path in May of 1854, collecting plants for the herbal practice she had inherited from her grandmother, a French Creole woman who had settled in the Ozarks in the 1820s. Lenore was 30 years old, unmarried and largely unbothered by that fact. She was small and dark-eyed, with sun-browned skin and a directness of manner that some people found refreshing and others found alarming. She spoke English and French with equal fluency and neither with particular delicacy. She knew the name of every plant that grew within 20 miles of Calvary, and she could set a bone, deliver a baby, and brew a tea that would break a fever, skills that made her indispensable to the valley's families and simultaneously suspicious to the valley's gossips. She heard the saw before she saw the mill, a rhythmic, rasping sound that carried up the gorge like the breathing of some enormous, mechanical animal. She followed the sound to the mill and stood on the bank above the wheel pit, watching the great wheel turn and the saw blade rise and fall as Eben guided a pine log through its teeth. "You're Pulk," she said when he noticed her. "I am. I heard you rebuilt Harker's mill." "I rebuilt a mill on Harker's foundation." She studied the wheel, the mill race, the bypass gate. "That gate wasn't Harker's." "No, that's mine." "Smart. Harker didn't respect the river. That's what killed him." Eben looked at her. People in Calvary did not usually speak about Harker's death so plainly. They spoke around it, the way people speak around any local tragedy, in euphemisms and hushed tones and the passive voice, as though the drowning had happened to itself. "The river didn't kill him," Eben said. "Poor engineering killed him. The river just did what rivers do." Lenor nodded. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of agreement between two people who saw the world in the same terms, not as a place of curses and divine punishments, but as a system of forces that could be understood, respected, and worked with. She came back the next day with a poultice for the blisters on Eben's hands, which she had noticed and he had not mentioned. She came back the day after that with a question about the hydraulic cement. She came back the day after that with no particular reason at all, and Eben, who was not a man given to self-deception, understood what was happening and did not resist it. Their courtship was practical and unhurried, conducted over shared meals at the mill cabin, walks along the river, and conversations that ranged from the medicinal properties of Ozark plants to the tensile strength of white oak, to the novels of Charles Dickens, which Lenor had read in French translation and Eben had read in English, and which they discovered they disagreed about with a vigor that delighted them both. They married in November of 1854 in a ceremony at the Presbyterian Church that Reverend Collis performed with evident pleasure. Gideon Searle attended, having revised his opinion of Eben sufficiently to offer a grudging handshake and the observation that "the mill seems to be holding up. I'll grant you that." Eben's brother Marcus sent a letter of congratulations from Little Rock. Owen, in Memphis, sent nothing. The Hadley brothers gave them a set of iron fireplace tools that Wick had forged himself, and Lenor's grandmother, who was 83 and sharp as a thorn, gave them a quilt she had pieced from fabric scraps accumulated over 40 years, each patch a different pattern, the whole thing a patchwork history of a life lived in careful pieces. Lenor moved into the cabin above the gorge and immediately made it her own. She planted a kitchen garden on the flat ground behind the cabin. Herbs, vegetables, and medicinal plants arranged with the systematic precision of a woman who understood that a garden was both a pharmacy and a pantry. She built a drying shed for her plant harvest, using lumber from the mill's saw. She hung bundles of dried sage, mint, yarrow, and golden seal from the cabin's rafters until the interior smelled like a forest distilled to its essence. She also, to Eben's surprise and admiration, took over the mill's accounts. Lenor's grandmother had taught her arithmetic alongside herbalism, and her bookkeeping was meticulous. Every bushel ground, every board cut, every dollar earned and spent, recorded in a ledger with the same care she brought to her plant catalog. Within months, she had identified inefficiencies in the toll system and suggested adjustments that increased the mill's income by nearly 20%. "You're better at this than I am," Eben told her one evening, reviewing the ledger by firelight. "I'm better at numbers," Lenor corrected. "You're better at the river." It was a fair division, and they honored it. The years turned like the wheel, steady, productive, accumulating force. Their first child, a daughter named Marguerite after Lenor's grandmother, was born in August of 1856. The birth took place in the cabin above the gorge, and the first sound Marguerite heard, after her own cry, after Lenor's exhausted laughter, after Eben's murmured thanks to whatever force governed such miracles, was the wheel turning below. It would be the background sound of her entire childhood, so constant and so familiar that she would not notice it until she was grown and away and living somewhere flat and still, and would wake in the night missing a sound she could not name. A son, Amos, named after Amos Harker, because Eben believed that a name carried forward was a form of redemption, followed in 1858. Amos was born during a spring storm that swelled the river and set the wheel spinning fast, and Lenor said afterward that the boy had arrived with the speed and force of moving water, which proved to be prophetic. A second daughter, Cecile, came in 1861, the year the war began. The children grew up in the sound and rhythm of the mill. Marguerite learned to read sitting on the grinding floor, her primer propped against a sack of wheat, the vibration of the millstones humming through her legs. Amos learned to count by tallying bushels in the toll ledger and to multiply by calculating gear ratios. Cecile learned the alphabet from the letters Lenor painted on the cabin walls, each one illustrated with a plant: A for arnica, B for bergamot, C for chamomile. Their education was unconventional but thorough, a blend of Lenor's herbalism, Eben's mechanics, and the books that arrived in steady supply from a bookseller in Fayetteville who had learned to appreciate the Pulk's business. The Civil War reached the Ozarks with a particular cruelty. Arkansas seceded, but the mountain counties were divided. Union sympathizers and Confederate loyalists lived side by side, and the conflict became as much a civil war within the community as between the states. Bushwhackers and jayhawkers roamed the hills, burning farms and stealing livestock. The regular armies passed through twice, stripping the country of food and forage. Eben declared no allegiance. He ground grain for whoever brought it, blue coat or gray. It made no difference to the millstones. This neutrality earned him enemies on both sides, but also a grudging utility that protected the mill from the worst of the destruction. Both armies needed flour. Both armies needed lumber. The mill was more valuable intact than burned, and Eben made certain that both sides understood this, quietly and without fanfare. He also hid the mill's earnings. Lenor, with the practical cunning of a woman whose grandmother had survived the displacement of the Creole communities, kept a false ledger showing modest income and a true ledger hidden beneath a flagstone in the cabin floor. By the war's end, they had saved over $1,000, a fortune in a county where most families had been reduced to subsistence. The worst moment came in the winter of 1863, when a company of Confederate irregulars rode into the gorge and demanded that Eben grind 300 bushels of corn for their supply train without toll. Eben agreed. He had no choice. There were 40 armed men in his mill yard, but he ground the corn carefully, as he ground everything, and when the captain complimented the flour's quality, Eben said only, "It's the stones. French burr. They don't make grit." The captain, A young man with tired eyes and a colonel's bearing, despite his irregular rank, looked at Eben for a long moment. "You're a Union man," he said. "I'm a miller," Eben replied. "The river doesn't care about politics, and neither do my stones." The captain almost smiled. He left without burning the mill, which was more than many mills in Arkansas could say that winter. After the war, Eben expanded. The lathe was operational by 1866, the trip hammer by 1868. The mill became a complete workshop. Grain, lumber, turned wooden goods, and forged iron, all powered by the same river that had killed Amos Harker 25 years before. Farmers brought their wheat and corn, carpenters brought their logs, blacksmiths brought their iron stock. The gorge, which had been a place of superstition and death, became the productive heart of the valley. People came not just for the services, but for the spectacle. There was something mesmerizing about the mill in full operation, the great wheel turning in its pit, water cascading from bucket to bucket in a white curtain, the main shaft spinning with a deep hum that you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. The gears meshed with a precision that seemed almost organic, as though the mill were a living thing, breathing in water and breathing out work. Children came to watch. Their parents came to grind grain and stayed to watch too. The gorge, which had been a place people avoided, became a place people gathered, and Eben, who had never sought company, found himself at the center of a small community that revolved, like everything else in his life, around the turning of a wheel. He began teaching. Not formally. He had no classroom, no curriculum, but in the way that a man who understands something deeply cannot help explaining it to those who ask. Farmers' sons came to the mill to learn mechanics. A young man from Fayetteville came to study the hydraulic cement. A professor from the state college came to measure the wheel's efficiency and left with pages of notes and a standing invitation to return. Eben explained everything with the same patient clarity. How the gears converted horizontal rotation to vertical drive, how the millstone dress affected flour quality, how the bypass gate prevented the disaster that had killed Harker. He taught because knowledge, like water, was meant to flow, and because the alternative was hoarding, which was a form of waste. Eben added a second wheel in 1870, a smaller breast wheel on a parallel race, designed to power the forge bellows and the trip hammer independently of the main grinding and sawing operations. The engineering was complex, two wheels drawing from the same river, their races carefully calibrated to divide the flow without starving either wheel. Eben spent 6 months on the calculations alone, filling notebook after notebook with diagrams and figures, testing and retesting his water volume estimates before committing to construction. He built a scale model first, a miniature gorge fashioned from clay and limestone chips, with tiny wooden wheels and a diverted stream from the underground spring behind the cabin, and ran it for 3 weeks, adjusting the race dimensions until both wheels turned at their designed speed. The second wheel worked. It worked beautifully. And with its completion, Eben's mill became something that had no real parallel in the Ozark region. A fully integrated water-powered manufacturing facility, producing flour, lumber, turned goods, and forged hardware from a single site, powered entirely by the Little Mulberry's 14-foot drop through a limestone gorge. Gideon Searle died in 1874 of a stroke suffered while arguing about fence lines with a neighbor. His farm, the best bottomland in the county, was divided among his children, who subdivided it among theirs, and within a generation, the Searle land was fragmented into parcels too small to be profitable. The family name faded from Calvary's conversation. Eben thought of Searle sometimes, not with satisfaction, not with bitterness, but with the melancholy recognition that land, unlike water, could be exhausted. Searle had treated his soil the way a man treats a thing he owns. Eben had treated the river the way a man treats a thing he borrows. The difference, across 40 years, was the difference between depletion and endurance. The mill endured. Eben grew old in the sound of water. It was, he often said, the most honest sound in the world. Water did not lie. It did not pretend to be more or less than it was. It flowed downhill. It sought the lowest path. It wore away stone with a patience that made human patience look like impatience. And it never, ever stopped. You could dam it, divert it, channel it, harness it, but you could not stop it. And if you were wise enough to work with it rather than against it, it would do your work for you, day and night, year after year, asking nothing in return but the freedom to keep flowing. Lenor shared his philosophy, though she expressed it through plants rather than water. She had built her herbal practice into something approaching a profession. Women came to her from across the county, for remedies, for advice, for the particular comfort of being listened to by someone who took their symptoms seriously. She trained Marguerite in the same skills, and the daughter proved even more gifted than the mother, with an intuitive understanding of plant chemistry that anticipated formal pharmacology by decades. Amos, their son, inherited Eben's mechanical mind. By the age of 14, he could disassemble and reassemble the mill's gearing system blindfolded. He understood water pressure and gear ratios with an instinct that no book had given him, though books refined it. Eben watched his son with the quiet satisfaction of a man who sees his own best qualities reflected in a younger face, not copied, but translated into a new language. Cecile, the youngest, was the scholar. She devoured books the way the millstones devoured grain, and at 16, she announced her intention to attend the female seminary in Fayetteville, which she did, graduating with honors and going on to teach school in 3 different Arkansas towns before settling in Calvary to run the county's first public library, an institution she funded in part with profits from the mill. Lenor died in the spring of 1887 of a cancer that she had diagnosed herself 6 months before any doctor confirmed it. She faced it with the same directness she brought to everything. No denial, no self-pity, just a clear-eyed assessment of what was happening and a methodical effort to put her affairs in order. She cataloged her entire herbal collection, writing detailed instructions for Marguerite on the preparation and dosage of each remedy. She organized 40 years of plant specimens, pressing and labeling each one with the scientific name, the common name, the location and date of collection, and its medicinal use. She updated the mill ledger on the morning of the day she died, her handwriting steady and precise to the last entry. The final line read, "Received from J. Prewitt, 400 pounds winter wheat." Toll collected. Eben was with her when she went. It was April, and through the open window of the cabin, they could hear the river running high with spring melt and the wheel turning fast in the flood current. Lenor listened to it and said, "That's a good sound to go out on." Eben could not speak. He held her hand. "Don't stop the wheel for me," she said. "The wheat won't wait." They were the last words she spoke. Eben kept his promise. The wheel did not stop. He buried her on the bluff above the gorge, where the sound of the wheel and the river reached every hour of every day. He planted wild roses at the head of her grave, because she had always said that wild roses were more honest than cultivated ones. They bloomed when they chose, not when you wanted them to. The roses took hold in the rocky soil and spread along the bluff edge, and for years afterward, in May and June, The entire ridgeline above the gorge was lined with their pale pink blossoms, visible from the mill below like a ribbon of color laid along the sky. He lived 5 more years. They were quiet years, but not empty ones. The grief for Lenor did not diminish. It settled, the way sediment settles in still water, becoming part of the substrate of his days rather than the current. He found that he could think of her now without the sharp pain of the first months, that her memory had become less like a wound and more like a companion, present, gentle, permanent. He spent his mornings at the mill, working less, but watching more. He would sit on the stone wall above the wheel pit for hours, listening to the water, watching the wheel turn, feeling the vibration of the machinery through the rock beneath him. The sound had changed over the years, as the gears wore and the bearings settled, but the fundamental rhythm was the same, the deep, steady pulse of water becoming work, of gravity becoming force, of a river's patience becoming a man's livelihood. It was, Eben thought, the closest thing to music that mechanics could produce. Amos handled the daily operations with a competence that made Eben proud and, occasionally, unnecessary. But Eben came to the gorge each morning because the gorge was where he belonged. It was where the river ran. It was where the wheel turned. It was where a pile of rubble had become a life. In the evenings, he sat on the cabin porch and wrote in his notebooks. Not the technical notes of his younger years, calculations and flow rates and bearing tolerances, but reflections about the nature of work, about the relationship between a man and a river, about what it meant to take something broken and make it whole, not by imposing your will on it, but by understanding what it had been and helping it become that again. He wrote, "A mill is not a building. A mill is a relationship between water and stone. The building is just where the relationship happens." He wrote, "Harker died because he fought the river. I lived because I listened to it. The difference is not courage. The difference is attention." He wrote, "My brothers thought I was wasting my life. Perhaps I was. But if waste is what produces flour and lumber and iron and children and 40 years of mornings beside a turning wheel, then waste has been kind to me." On a warm evening in February of 1892, Amos came to the cabin and found his father sitting on the porch, looking down at the gorge. The wheel was turning in the late winter current, slower than it would turn in spring, but steady, always steady. "Pa," Amos said, sitting beside him. "Son, the east bearing is wearing. I'll need to redress it before spring grinding. Use the granite, not the limestone. Limestone won't hold." "I know, Pa." Eben smiled. "I know you know. I just like saying it." They sat for a while in the sound of the river. "Your mother kept better books than I ever did," Eben said. "You keep the books the way she did. Don't let the numbers slip." "I won't. And the bypass gate. Check it every spring before the melt comes. That gate is the difference between a mill and a ruin." "I know, Pa. And teach your children. Teach them the water. Teach them the gears. Teach them that a river is not a thing you own. It's a thing you borrow." Amos nodded. He had heard these lessons before, in various forms, for 34 years. They were not less true for the repetition. Eben died on March 12, 1892, at the age of 75. He was sitting in his chair on the cabin porch, looking down at the gorge, where the wheel was turning in the spring current. Amos found him there in the late afternoon, his eyes closed, his face peaceful, his hands folded in his lap. The same long, quiet hands that had moved 50 tons of stone and built 2 wheels and ground 1,000,000 bushels of grain and held his wife's hand as she died and written 1,000 pages of careful notes about water and wood and stone. Amos recorded the date in the mill ledger, in a hand that shook only slightly. March 12th, 1892. Pa died today. The wheel is turning. The Pulk mill operated for another 40 years after Eben's death. Amos ran it until 1910, when he passed it to his own son, Eben II, who modernized the gearing with cast iron and added an electric generator that provided power to a dozen homes in the valley, the first electricity in the county, produced not by coal or oil, but by the same river that had been turning wheels in the gorge since 1832. The Hadley family remained connected to the mill throughout. Wick Hadley's grandson served as Amos's head miller for 20 years, and the two families, Polk and Hadley, became so intertwined through work and friendship, and eventually marriage, that the distinction between them blurred into something closer to kinship. It was a Hadley who maintained the bypass gate through the great flood of 1927, when the Little Mulberry rose higher than at any point since Harker's drowning, and the gate held and the mill survived exactly as Eben had designed it to. The mill finally closed in 1934, overtaken by diesel-powered facilities that could be built anywhere, unconstrained by the geography of gorges and waterfalls. The building stood empty for 2 decades. The wheel slowed and stopped as the mill race silted in. The gorge returned to quiet. Wild roses, descendants of the bushes Eben had planted at Lenor's grave, crept down the bluff face and grew up through the cracks in the mill floor, and for a time, the site looked like what Gideon Searle had always predicted it would become: a ruin, reclaimed by nature, forgotten. But in 1958, a team of historians from the University of Arkansas rediscovered the site. They found the hydraulic cement intact after a century, still hard, still bonded to the stone, still resisting the river's erosion with a stubbornness that astonished the engineers who tested it. They found the granite-bearing blocks still true, their concave surfaces worn smooth by decades of rotation, but dimensionally precise to within a fraction of an inch. They found Eben's notebooks, dozens of them, stored in a trunk in the cabin, containing detailed records of water flow, grinding volumes, mechanical designs, and the day-by-day chronicle of a man who had taken a ruin and made it run. A civil engineer from the university, reading the notebooks for the first time, called them a masterclass in practical hydraulics, written by a man who never attended a single lecture. They also found Lenor's ledgers, 40 years of meticulous financial records that documented not just the mill's business, but the economic life of an entire Ozark community. Historians would later use them to reconstruct commodity prices, trade patterns, and the rhythms of agricultural life in post-Civil War Arkansas, with a detail that no other source could match. The mill was restored in 1962 and designated a state historic site in 1970. The wheel turns again today. A reconstruction built to Eben's original specifications, turning in the same current, in the same gorge, on the same granite bearings that Amos Harker set in 1832 and that Eben Pulk cleared and trusted in 1851. Visitors come to see it. School groups, history enthusiasts, engineers who want to study the hydraulic cement, families who want to watch a wheel turn and feel the spray of the mill race on their faces and hear the sound that Eben heard every morning for 40 years. The 14-foot drop still falls. The Little Mulberry still runs. The sound of it carries up the gorge the way it carried when Eben first climbed down into the rubble with a pry bar and a notebook, and a conviction that a turning wheel, however broken, was not a dead thing, but a patient one. Some forces don't stop. They just wait for someone to notice them. The river had been turning the wheel for 8 years before Eben Pulk spent his dollar. It would have gone on turning for 8 more, or 80, or 800. Water is patient that way. It does not resent being ignored. It simply continues. All it needed was someone willing to clear the stones.